the physical climate risk assessment. And finally, we hope that you will understand better how to approach physical climate risks, how to structure this work and prioritize your resources. All right, and let us start with the first Zoom poll. And I would like to ask CMM team to help us with pulling up first Zoom questions. This is also for us to understand a bit better how well you're familiar with the topic, and also collect some of your initial comments. So first question, you should be able to see a pop-up window now. And by the way, you can also scroll down to see all the 4 questions. So first question is about your understanding of climate versus weather. So which of the following is an example of a climate characteristic of a location? With 4 answer examples, like an intense thunderstorm in Langkawi, an extremely hot day in Penang, a foggy season in Kota Kinabalu, or an average summer temperature in Kuala Lumpur over the last 50 years. Question number 2 and number 3 is to get your opinion, which of the following sectors do you feel are the most exposed and can benefit the most from climate change impacts? And there is no right or wrong answer. We just would like to hear your opinion. Finally, the last question is, how do you think climate change will influence investment trends? And the answers are, it will not influence, it may impact investment trends in the future. It has already impacted and continue to do so, or you don't have an answer to the question. Now let's wait a few more moments while we're collecting answers. And I can see a lot of answers are coming in, and then we can pull them up on the screen. Okay, interesting. Okay, I think we can put the answers that we have received so far. And let's see what the results are. Okay, so question number 1 was about difference between climate and weather, which we will discuss very shortly. And yes, the majority answered right. The climate is about an average characteristic over the long time, rather than just one single climate phenomenon. Second question was about the sector's exposure to climate-related risks. And interestingly, the majority answered food and agriculture, followed by such sectors as power, oil and gas, mining, transportation, health and healthcare. So basically, we can say that to a certain degree, more or less all sectors would be exposed to climate change. It's just that the impacts may be different. And especially if you take a look, not just at the operations themselves, but along the whole value chain. Third question was about which sectors could benefit from climate change. And interestingly, the majority, over 50%, think that could be power. Indeed, if you look into the sector from the perspective of renewable energy and other innovative energy sources appearing on the market. And followed by food, agriculture, health, healthcare, transportation. And again, the picture is the same. So all sectors, in fact, can benefit to a certain degree. It's just a matter what the impact would be. Final question was about how climate change will influence investment trends. And the vast majority, almost 90% of the participants today think that it has already impacted and will continue to do so in the future. All right, thank you very much for those results. And we move on with the presentation of today, starting with what climate change is. And as you rightfully mentioned in the poll, it's indeed about the long-term patterns in a certain location. It's quite an important concept to understand, because if we look into very specific weather events, say a thunderstorm or extremely hot day, you cannot judge about the climate by this single activity. So when we talk about climate change, and Aniket will of course explain it in more detail, we definitely need to look into trends over decades, historical trends and future trends as well. And what may climate change, of course, bring is the higher frequency or severity of these climate related activities. But once again, by single event, you cannot judge the climate. And our today's session is very timely. As you may have heard, earlier this month, on the 9th of August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has issued a long-awaited first volume of the current sixth assessment report. So this is the report that really summarizes all the most recent scientific data, findings, analysis around climate change, and more specifically about physical impacts of climate change. For those of you who haven't read it yet, there is a link and we will share the slides with you after the session. So you are very welcome to look into this report in more detail. And there is, for your convenience, an executive summary. So you don't need to go through all the scientific details. But what is key for us out of this report already? First of all, climate change is of course happening, and it's happening even faster than it was forecasted by the previous fifth assessment report a few years ago. For example, all scenarios that have been developed by IPCC say that already by 2040, we have all the chances to reach 1.5 degree mark. And now the challenge is really to stabilize this global temperature growth at this 1.5 degrees Celsius cap and avoid further global warming beyond this temperature. And to do so, we really need to accelerate the low carbon economy transition, which would link us, of course, to the next session tomorrow, speaking about low carbon economy transition risks and opportunities for businesses. You can also see that such a climate impacts like sea level or surface temperature are increasing faster than it was again forecasted in the previous report. And most importantly is that all of that is also linked to a big degree of to human activities and greenhouse gas emissions. So this is where it links back to businesses and industries and you distinguished participants, because all kind of activities related to industrial sectors, of course, or energy use, of course, would be linked to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something we all need to work around to address in order to be in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius global target. Some key findings for Southeast Asia. One of the things we would like to mention is that luckily, warming is not happening as fast in Southeast Asia as in other parts of the world, say the Arctic regions, where the temperature increase is much more dramatic. But at the same time, temperature is not the only thing that really characterizes climate change. There are a lot of linked climate changes that are happening in the system, such as, for example, increased severity and frequency, different climate events, changing precipitation patterns, increased seasonalities, and so on. And all of these, of course, in turn impact economy, human beings, our health, and biodiversity and ecosystems. So as you can see here, for example, there are higher flood levels and higher inundation in the Mekong Delta predicted by scientists. At the same time, more extreme tropical cyclones, even though they may become fewer in numbers, they become much more stronger going forward. And as you can see as well, monsoon precipitation is predicted to increase over time, which will again in turn impact operations and supply chains. Lastly, in this introductory part, I would like to highlight that climate-related risks have been already recognized by the World Economic Forum and the global financial community and global business community as one of the key risks these days. And moreover, climate change is actually interlinked with a lot of other ESG topics. social, economic, environmental, as you can see on the slide on the left. So addressing climate change would mean also addressing a lot of other different issues at the same time, and that could be also beneficial for your business. With that, I would like to move to the next part of today's discussion, emerging market drivers around climate-related risks and opportunities. And of course, one of the main drivers globally for climate action is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement linked to this convention, which was adopted back in 2015. So as of today, more than 190 countries have signed up to Paris Agreement, and around the same number of countries have already taken their nationally determined contributions or targets to limit their emissions of greenhouse gases and other measures that are linked to climate action. But countries are not the only actors that take climate action. There are a lot more activities going on at the company level, at the financial system level, or at the city level, for example. As you can see here, as an example on the slide, there are more than 850 companies that have already set their own climate-related targets in line with the Paris Agreement and well below 2 degrees Celsius future. So with that said, definitely there is a lot going on and more ambitious actions would be expected from all actors around the world in addressing climate-related impacts. And for those of you who may have not heard, but in November this year, there will be the next climate change conference under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement that is aimed to address further application of these international treaties and what they would actually mean to businesses as well in terms of potential of using market-related and no-market mechanism for climate actions. Linking back to TCFD discussion, we would like to say that climate-related disclosures and overall transparency around how companies are looking into their greenhouse gas emissions and into how they address and manage climate-related risks is becoming a global trend and almost like a benchmark. And you can see in the middle some of the well-recognized international frameworks like TCFD, CDP, DJSI, GRI, SASB, Equator Principles, all of them already have very distinguished climate change components, if not a whole frameworks are dedicated to climate. And all of them are also linked back to the issue of climate-related risks and opportunities and how those impact businesses. And as you can see on this slide, there are different actors out there who are very much driving this agenda, starting from the whole financial system and financial regulators. An increasing number of regulators around Asia and the Pacific are already providing guidelines or even making climate-related disclosures mandatory. And we know for the fact that Bursa Malaysia is also working on TCFD guidelines for Malaysia-listed companies, for example. Lenders, so banks increasingly are also introducing climate-related risks and opportunities into their due diligence processes. And as you may know, there is this global initiative called Principles for Responsible Banking that also is nowadays linked to TCFD framework. Investors the same, that's actually working with a lot of companies around Asia and the Pacific. We've noticed that many of our clients are first and foremost driven by the investors' expectations in terms of transparency of greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks management. So companies really start looking into these issues from like being pushed by the investors and shareholders. Finally, as you can see in the right bottom corner, there are more than 2,300 supporters of TCFD framework these days, including a lot of different companies across Asia and the Pacific, in Malaysia in particular, and this number is growing. So definitely TCFD is becoming one of the trends these days. And as you can see here on this slide, drivers are different, again, starting from investors' expectations and evolving policy landscapes. Markets and technologies change as well, pushing companies to look into new areas of business, diversifying their product and services portfolio. At the same time, as we mentioned already, there are physical impacts of climate change, both on operations and on the whole supply chain. Again, driving companies to look into physical climate risks. And from our perspective, TCFD framework and the whole agenda of climate-related risks and opportunities should be taken from the perspective of future opportunities for business, how this all can really help you to transform your business, transform the way you strategize, the way you position yourselves, and really can become a very good competitive advantage if you manage to grasp this issue well on time. And with that, I would like to move to the next agenda point, which is the TCFD framework itself. A very brief recap, because I'm sure most of you are already familiar, at least somewhat, with this framework. But before we go, actually, let's check how well you understand it. And there are 3 questions that we would like you to answer. The first one, what is the main focus of TCFD disclosures? And the options are companies' greenhouse gas emissions, companies' climate commitments, companies' sustainability performance, or companies' resilience to climate-related financial impacts. And then there are 2 questions on your understanding of the difference between physical and transition impacts of climate change. And the first of these 2 questions is whether it's transition of physical risk, transitional markets and asset values facing disruption from new technologies such as electric vehicles. And second, increased incidence and severity of extreme weather events such as floods or cyclones. Should be easy, but let's wait maybe a few moments for the answers. Okay. I can see that we have already the majority answered. So let's maybe pull up the results. Thank you very much. So the first question was about the main focus of TCFD. And while most of those points, if not all, are actually somewhat covered by TCFD disclosures, the main focus of it is, of course, companies' resilience to climate-related financial impacts. We'll talk about this in a second. Then the next question was about traditional markets and asset values facing disruption from new technologies such as electric vehicles. Well, this is more on the transition side. So this is an example of a risk related to low carbon economy transition. Whereas question number 3, increased incidence and severity of extreme weather events, such as floods and cyclones, is more on the side of the physical climate impacts on the businesses. Thank you. And with that, let's move on to TCFD. A very quick recap indeed. So TCFD as a framework was established back at, it was established back in 2015 under the Financial Stability Board of the Group of 20. But the first TCFD recommendations in relation to climate-related disclosures were published in 2017. What is important about TCFD and what it makes different from all other climate or issue-related frameworks? That it looks into the global financial systems and companies in particular, not from the perspective of how companies create risks for environmental or social aspects, but rather how climate change impacts the businesses and the global financial system. So it's very important difference. So in this particular case, the company itself is a subject to the risk related to climate change. And from that perspective, TCFD looks at the companies, businesses, and financial system. Second important difference of this framework, it was from the start developed for investors, lenders, and companies all alike. And in the first place, of course, investors and lenders would like to see companies' performance against climate-related impacts and how prepared and ready they are to address those risks. But at the same time, lenders and investors themselves are also bound to develop their own disclosures. So in that sense, that there are these important loops created by TCFD framework. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there are four main disclosure pillars of TCFD, which are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And all of that related to climate-related risks and opportunities and their financial impact on the business. So as I mentioned already, TCFD is for all key actors in this system, companies, banks, and investors. So the whole idea of TCFD is really to standardize approaches around how climate-related risks and opportunities and their financial impacts are assessed and managed by all key players. And this is another important slide to understand what is the actual scope of the TCFD framework. So as you can see here, TCFD covers both physical climate change risks that we will talk about today, as well as risks related to low carbon economy transition. But at the same time, it also encourages companies to look into potential opportunities related to low carbon economy transition and physical impacts, such as resource efficiency, energy sources, product services, markets, and overall resilience of business. However, the key of TCFD is really this blue box in the middle and everything at the bottom of this picture, financial impact. It's really not just about climate impacts and implications, it's about financial impacts of climate change on businesses. So that's a very, very important point to make. And of course, these impacts need to be assessed over multiple time periods and various scenarios, which we'll talk about today, in particular for physical climate risks. Speaking about physical climate scenarios, my colleague Aniket will talk more about it, but just key highlights from TCFD recommendations. First of all, organizations should describe how resilient their strategies are in relation to climate-related risks and the various scenarios. IPCC, mentioned already before, is name-checked as a source that can provide good scientific evidence and context for a company for their physical risks assessment. The general guidance about timelines is about 2030, 2050 and beyond. And again, Aniket will explain a little bit more about the typical time horizons for physical risks assessment. For scenarios, again, for physical climate risks, we typically use scenarios of IPCC, and in the previous assessment report, those were representative concentration pathway scenarios, or RCPs as they're called. And the one that is particularly recommended for physical risks is RCP 8.5. Again, I won't stop too much here in detail, but Aniket will explain how it works. And finally, some of the hazards mentioned in TCFD can include temperature, wildfires, water supply and demand, precipitation, hurricanes. But again, there is no like a single standardized list. It can vary depending on your sector and your business, which hazards would be prioritized. This is just a very brief explanation of different scenarios and their selection depending on whether you look into physical risks or transition risks. For physical risks, we normally take into consideration what we call the worst case climate change scenario, which represents basically the most dramatic climate changes towards the end of the century, which in the past was also linked to the RCP scenario 8.5 of IPCC. And the reason is if your business and financial system is resilient enough to the worst case scenario, then you would definitely be resilient to milder scenarios in the future. So that's the principal difference of scenario selection for physical risks versus transition risks, where low carbon scenarios would be of most importance and of most impact to businesses. This is the typical process for TCFD. Well, as you can see here, it's a journey, and it has been always meant to be a journey. And obviously, it's a multi-year journey, even though a company can, of course, address all key TCFD disclosure pillars already from year one. From every year, the depth of the analysis, of course, goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And as you can see here, the typical steps would involve, of course, your internal stakeholder engagement and governance, followed by assessment of key material risks, both on the physical and transition side, identification of key scenarios and scenario-related drivers, understanding how those can impact your business, first qualitatively, then more quantitatively, and going to potential response measures and your business strategy, how that could adjust to the results of the analysis. And of course, last but not the least is the actual disclosure, because TCFD framework is first of all about actual transparency and disclosure of your business impact in relation to climate change. Once again, it's a journey, and here is just a very high-level example of how this journey could look like over the first 3 years, starting from basic foundations like the governance setup and climate awareness, stakeholder engagement within your organization, qualitative baseline assessment of key material risks and opportunities for a business, and other basic things. Then in year 2, going into more detail of quantification of business impacts and more detailed strategy stress testing. And of course, in the following years, you can already start looking into more asset-specific data and resilience, developing adaptation plan, and so on. The good point is that investors are not expecting full information at once from year 1, but definitely they would expect increasing depth of your disclosures over time. Lastly, I would just like to highlight how TCFD disclosures look like in a pack. There are, as we mentioned before, more than 828 supporters just in a pack out of 2,800 supporters globally. Japan is leading, pretty much driven by the governmental initiatives. But as you can see in our region in Southeast Asia, there are already a lot of supporters and disclosures in relation to TCFD. And lastly, some of the key gaps that are still there in the current disclosure, especially in our region, where a lot of companies are still in the early days of the TCFD process. And as you can see here, a lot of companies actually struggling with the scenario analysis and also claiming that that's quite confidential, and how actually we could disclose information related to business impacts, which is the ultimate expectation of TCFD. We're happy to take some of your questions that we already have in the chat. And in the meantime, maybe very high-level takeaways from this first introductory part, and before we move on to the physical risks in more detail. So once again, there is a lot of pressure in terms of TCFD disclosures, and definitely globally companies and financial institutions are moving towards better and deeper TCFD disclosures, becoming almost like an international trend. And TCFD framework is also very integrated into various ESG frameworks, ratings, rankings, again, becoming a benchmark on the market. You don't need to worry that it's a lot and at once. That's meant to be a journey. So of course, at least starting from foundations during the first year and then improving over the assessments and disclosures over time is what TCFD is encouraging companies to do. All right, with that said, I think I will stop here and let us see if there are any burning questions in the chat. Okay, first question about climate change adaptation options. I think we will park it for the second session after Aniket's presentation. How we help smaller companies like SMEs to adapt to CFD. Okay, that's a good one. Actually, TCFD is meant for all kind of companies, not necessarily only for big ones. And I would even say not only for companies, but all kind of organizations. And you can see around TCFD supporters that there are a lot of entities that are not necessarily businesses, like governmental entities, as well as public companies, and of course, financial institutions. And regardless of your size, you can still do your background work in relation to TCFD, and we can probably discuss it a little bit in more detail at the end of the session. What would be considered as audit standard disclosures? Has any guidance been issued? Well, actually, it's still a recommendation. TCFD are recommendatory, and in some markets there are mandatory TCFD disclosures, but again, there is still a way how you can interpret the TCFD disclosures. So a short answer, no, there is no like standard assurance as it is, say, for GHG emissions inventories. But again, there are typical expectations, what needs to be in the TCFD disclosure. How to get the data, historical project. Okay, we'll get to that during the next session. Are we going to see TCFD being incorporated into the GRI framework? Yes, it's already happening. And actually not just GRI, but many other frameworks, and increasingly so. So definitely more and more we will see sustainability reports also including TCFD disclosures. All right, I think we can stop here. I know that there are more questions and more coming. Please keep up doing that, and we will be picking them up during the second part of the session today. Aniket, over to you.
Hey, Yulia, thanks a lot for the wonderful introduction around the climate change physical risk assessment and the TCFD. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Aniket Jalgaonkar. As Yulia just introduced me, I am a principal consultant and lead the climate change physical risk assessment services in the Asia Pacific region. I'm based out of India. So, I will be walking you through the next few sessions to kind of give you an hands-on information around what climate-related physical risks are, primarily focusing on three aspects: climate hazards, climate risks, and what are the various scenarios which are useful for us to consider while we're doing our climate change risk assessment. I come from India. It is one of the most impacted geographies in the world, where every year we see a new natural hazard and a new climate hazard popping its head up and disrupting industries, societies, and overall impacts. So what are physical climate hazards really? So what you can see in front of the screen right now is just a few examples of it. So these could be extreme temperature changes. So some things that we are seeing very often in this part of the world, aren't we? It could be coming in terms of flooding. We are seeing many cities across various countries in the Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia getting flooded more frequently than they used to do early on a few decades back. We are also seeing a lot of cyclones happening, aren't we? There's so many of new cyclones that are happening that the World Meteorological Organization now has to scout for new names to be given to these cyclones. We can see wildfires engulfing so many new geographies than before, and the geographies which are already exposed, such as down south in Australia, we are seeing them increasing in their frequency and intensity. We have more and more landslides happening, especially during rain events, where the slopes are no longer stable because of extreme precipitation events, which can lead to more and more number of landslides. And water stress and droughts is, I would say, the most intense and the most material climate stressor that most countries in this part of the world are facing right now, and will continue to increase in the coming years. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I think there's something wrong on my side. Right, so Physical climate risks, and what I've tried to put here in front of you, ladies and gentlemen, is a really world map and the past decade. And I'm not even talking about too many years. It's just the last 8 to 10 years. We see that there have been a variety of climate-related hazards that have impacted geographies across continents. You had the Hurricane Sandy that caused a huge damage of around $62 billion back in 2012. And more recently, in 2021, in North America, we had the Houston extreme cold, where the entire state came to a grinding halt because of the temperatures plummeting down to numbers which they had never experienced ever before. We've got drought-like situations coming up in Africa. We have seen the heat waves in Europe, which actually took away almost 1,500 lives in 20 too long ago either. Flooding happening in China. The same thing repeated in the year 2021, where we are right now. We had closer to where we are. We saw 2010 flooding that happened in Malaysia, which actually impacted the country significantly. In the 2011 floods in Bangkok, or in south of Thailand, it actually led to damages worth of approximately just shy of $50 billion. So that's the kind of spread of climate risks that we are already facing. And in each of these cases, it is not only impacting lives, disrupting societies, impacting businesses, but also having a serious hit on the country's GDP. So a quick introduction to what climate-wave physical risks are, and how do you actually go around doing a physical risk assessment. So it's really a combination of hazards, vulnerabilities, and risks. So what we do here is assess the location, the severity, the frequency of occurrence of a certain climate event or a climate hazard happening, and at what magnitude that might happen. So that's basically a classical example of what a climate hazard is. Then we move on to risks, which is really a combination of probability of a hazardous event happening and its negative consequences through interaction between hazards, exposure, and vulnerability components. And that brings us to the next point or next definition here of vulnerabilities, which are basically the characteristics and circumstances that make an asset susceptible to damaging effects of a hazard. So what we try to do here really is first find out what those climate hazards are, then do an estimation of what is the vulnerability of those assets towards those hazards. And when you multiply the two, what you really get is a classical exposure to the climate risk. So considering the onset or the timing of the risks, we typically categorize it in two parts. First is an acute wave physical risk, which is primarily an event-driven instance, which includes increasing severity of extreme weather events such as cyclones, hurricanes, or floods. So these events or these impacts are really related to a single event in a certain point of time. And then a second kind of a category of physical risks is the chronic risks, which refers to more long-term shifts in climate change and their patterns. And some of the examples of this is sea level rise and extreme heat waves as well, which you can see them happening every year. It gets hotter and hotter. Every 5 to 10 years, you see more and more coastal areas getting eroded away because of sea level rise. As Yulia mentioned, TCFD primarily focuses around financial impacts. And that is what also differentiates TCFD from some other types of ESG risks or ESG frameworks. So we try to actually put a dollar value to any climate related impacts that an asset or a business may really incur. So a physical risk assessment needs to be linked back to the financial impacts, and some of them are, what is the value at risk? How is it compromising the capital expenditure that is going into the project? How is it impacting the OPEX? Is it really leading to any downtime, which is in turn leading into any loss of revenue of the businesses? So some of the typical climate hazards, I just a couple of slides back, I showed you some of the key climate hazards. What we have tried to do here is get into a little deeper into what are those key climate hazard groups and what are the sub hazards or subcategories that can roll down under that. For example, if you're talking about temperature extremes, you can have heat waves in tropical countries. You can have cold spells as well, something that happened in the US earlier this year. You can have more and more frost and ice related events happening, which may impact human health and businesses. You can have average surface temperatures increasing. You have more and more permafrost being thawed, which is leading to a significant methane emission as well. And you have melting sea and fresh ice. That is what is also leading into sea level rise and the thermal expansion, and of course wind chill. So similarly, with respect to flooding, you can have riverine or fluvial floods happening. You may have flash floods or pluvial floods. Some other types of floodings could be groundwater flooding or sedimentation, or ice and debris jam flooding. This is also something called as landslides or avalanches, so on and so forth. On the coastal side, we're seeing as the increase in number of cyclones that we are experiencing every year. These cyclones have the ability to cause something called as storm surges, which means increasing surges or waves being brought onto the land areas, which leads to flooding in those areas. You've also got storm tides coming in. You've got estuarine floods, which is actually a major problem because estuarine systems are also very enriched with respect to biodiversity and ecology. Then all of these are eventually leading to coastal erosion, which leads to loss of land. Sea surface temperatures are also increasing, which leads to what we call as thermal expansion of sea water, which also kind of compounds the impacts of sea level rise happening around us. Then again, you have storms and winds happening. So with every year, you have more and more storms and winds happening. The tropical areas are, the equatorial areas are sometimes spared of this. You've got more and more cyclones and wind speed events happening in all parts of the world. You've got good wildfires in terms of forest fires, bush fires, grass fires. You have more and more pastures getting set on fire. And these are happening in areas which did not traditionally experience any of these. Landslides are also a result of extreme precipitation, be it snowfall or be it rainfall. And as I said, again, water stress or droughts, so something that is actually encompassing most of the areas in Southeastern Asia. So to consider now just the direct impacts of the hazard, but there are also so many indirect impacts such as ground stability, dust that is originating from fire, smoke billowing from these forest fires, which is leading to a major disruption all across the world. So this is a very interesting graph. It actually shows us transition from acceptable risks to unacceptable risks. So if you focus on the left side of the graph, you will see we are where we are right now. So we are looking at all the way till the past up to the present. And the graph that you see is really the amplitude of the various climate related events that have been happening historically. And what you see as a risk threshold is that minimum threshold that we are accustomed to right now, or I must say that we were accustomed to until a few years back. So as you go into the future, you will see that the amplitude of the graph has been going upwards, and it's also you can see more and more of those events increasing their frequency and intensity going beyond the risk threshold. So that is where we have already started making the transition from acceptable risk to unacceptable risk, where we are experiencing a larger number of more intense of those climate events having an impact on our assets and on our businesses. So the key to really cater to this is to move your risk threshold upwards, isn't it? So you just move that blue line a little to the north so that You can take care of most of these anomalies that are now increasing in their intensity and magnitude, and probably have a much easier way around some of these upcoming climate events. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what is called as climate adaptation. So we can't change the climate. We can certainly change the environment in which we are, so that that environment becomes more accustomed and it can become more resilient to the changing climate. And that's just a quick animation that we've tried to put in here. And you can see that in order to have the same resilience, you will have to move the risk threshold up to the north. So this brings us to opportunities. I think Yulia spoke so well about the fact that climate change has its risks, but there are sectors, there are organizations which can also look at these as an opportunity. So obviously, the first step towards identifying opportunities is to recognize that it is a risk, and then kind of bring out or start thinking about how you can mitigate those risks and convert those risks into opportunities. So there are really 5 phases of risk identification that we have here. First is really a denial, which means you just say that, no, it's not an issue at all, or it doesn't apply to us, or it's still too far away in the future. From there, you kind of move to the next phase, which is the discovery, which is still a definitional confusion, where you kind of have just started to accept it, but you still have to go through a process of learning to kind of become more aware of this. And then you go into a reactive mode, which is, I think, where most of the world today is. We are somewhere between reactive and proactive, of course, where we kind of realize that it is important that we protect our company. It is important that we preserve the license to operate, and we continue staying in environmental compliance, and we have a robust risk management system that is required to cater to these. And from there, you evolve into being a proactive organization, where you take all of those learnings from your reactiveness and you start developing and implementing strategies around reducing those climate risks, and also create value for customers, shareholders, and your employees. And from there, you go on to the last stage of maturity, which is transformatory, which is basically on organizations that have a very high risk intrinsically for the sector have started to do this. And it is basically the current model at risk, and or it's going to be a game changer in hand, because you know that if I alter the way that I do my business and become climate resilient or adaptive business, it's going to change the entire landscape for me. So that's really the maturity of any organization or organizations to actually accept, identify, recognize, and manage their climate-related risks. So you're using some of the latest open source databases. So how do you really identify what those climate risks are? And there are many tools which are available. These are open source tools. Apart from that, there are altered or customized services as well. And some of these have been put in front of you. So these portals are already doing a lot to kind of put all of that climate data out there for users to actually access it. But of course, it is linked to the spatial resolution as well. So you can actually move on to about 100 kilometers resolution all the way up to a few meters. So that's really the kind of a variety of assessments and data sets that are available to you to kind of become that a transformative kind of an approach towards identifying climate risks and actually quantifying them through the overall process. So we have a Zoom poll question for us. Just taking a short break there. So I would just request to get the poll on. So the question really is, how do you think physical climate risks can impact a project or a business? And we are getting some responses already. Okay, and we can see here that almost all of them seem to be material for all of us, isn't it? And I would say that all four of them are equally valid as well, because yes, physical climate risks and impact everything. It can increase your operating costs. It can increase the capital upgradation requirement. It can lead to insufficient or inefficient or stranded assets. And it can also impact our staff safety. And it's not just the staff safety, but also safety of our stakeholders and communities around us. So in the next session here, what I will be doing is walking you through the basic fundamentals of how to undertake climate change risk assessment, and what is the approach towards doing that, and also what is the journey towards adaptation and climate resilience. So a very key step in doing a climate change physical risk assessment, and the TCFD also suggests this as a very central piece, is to do a physical scenario analysis. So scenarios are those which model likely impacts of GHG concentrations on basic climatic parameters such as temperatures and precipitation. And we should be very mindful that scenarios are plausible descriptions on how the future may develop based on a coherent and internally consistent set of assumptions around driving forces. Now, some of these could be rate and extent of GHG emissions. And we should also know that these are nowhere close to being predictions or forecasts, and these are only plausible descriptions. So here, what you can see really is the overall four, what we call as representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. So these are the four emission trajectories that have been widely utilized, and they span all the way from an RCP 2.6, which is a best case scenario, through RCP 4.5, and RCP 6, and RCP 8.5, which is a worst case scenario. And as Yulia mentioned, the RCP 8.5 is something that will simulate what is the worst that can happen to us in the overall future years. Hence, it becomes very important for us to consider that, because if we are designing for that, then we can very easily adapt ourselves to the more milder scenarios as well. And so in doing a scenario analysis, there are two RCP scenarios that are usually considered. First is an RCP 4.5, which is best aligned towards reduction of the emissions and kind of aim towards keeping the global temperatures under 2.6 or 2 degrees, which is also closely aligned towards the Paris Agreement. This scenario is also referred to as an NDC, or nationally determined commitment scenario, because most countries around the world have already committed to this, and hence it's good to see, or it's good to stress test how those commitments and those regulations may actually pan out. And then you have the RCP 8.5, which, as I mentioned some time back, is a worst case or a business as usual scenario, where we will have the most extreme changes happening to the environment. So in terms of climate change physical risk assessment, we really like to divide it into two various phases. The phase one is what we call as a screening level qualitative risk assessment, or an hazard assessment, which kind of has 4 steps in it: determining what the physical domains are, then doing a scenario analysis, identifying climate hazards, and then eventually coming up with certain potential response measures. And then from there, we go into the phase 2, which is more around risk quantification, or putting a materiality on those risks, and also basis that developing an adaptation or resilience strategy. And over the next few slides, I will be trying to walk you through what these steps actually mean and how they can be actually achieved. So for us, in a screening level climate risk assessment, what we really do is try to first screen the baseline hazards in the 3-step process that you see here. So we review what the baseline or historical climate hazards are like, then kind of going to rank them. Then in a second step, we really look at the projections. So this is where we start looking at the global climatic models and regional climate models that have developed over the years. Now you have the IPCC AR6 report that has come out, and with that you also have what we call as CMIP6. On that's the most latest climate data sets that we have. Identify in step one, and what you really get is the combination of a combined ranking of both the baseline hazards and the climate change projections to actually estimate what the future climate risk would be like. So as I said, the step one really in doing this kind of a climate risk assessment is to identify what the physical domain is, which means where is my asset? What is the project boundary that I want to kind of identify or consider for the climate change risk assessment? And a very important aspect here is, yes, your own assets could certainly be at risk. You may do whatever it takes to actually protect them as part of your climate adaptation. But if your supply chain is still exposed to similar or different type of climate hazards or climate risks, then eventually it will impact your business because you won't be able to get in your raw materials or send out your finished products into the market as well. When I say supply chain, I don't only mean raw material and finished products, but also certain utilities which I am using, which are being transported onto my site from some distance. This could be gas, this could be electricity, this could be water, or any other utility that you could be using. We could also be talking about a transportation network. It could be railroads, it could be the highway networks, or even seaports from where your material is being sent in and out. So it's very important for any business to identify what is the physical domain that you want to consider as part of your climate change physical screening. From there, you really go on to a phase two. And I think I've spoken enough about the scenario analysis, but really you need to choose what those most appropriate climate scenarios or RCPs would be. We strongly suggest you choose a 8.5 as a worst case scenario, and to do that also complemented with RCP 4.5, which will be aligned with your nationally determined commitments as well. And you also choose your timelines. So typically there are 3 timelines across which climate risks can be mapped. Near term, which is also termed as quarter century or 2030. There is midterm or mid-century or 2050, and then there is a long-term or end century, which is a period extending from 2080 to 2100. So really depending upon an organization's aspirations and the climate goals, the investment cycles and their overall lifespan of their assets or their business, you can actually choose which of the timelines suit you the most. And this graph really shows you why it is important to do a scenario analysis. The map that you can see to your right actually shows you how the world will look so much differently between an RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5, because the extremes that you will experience in the future years would be much more than what we have right now in an RCP 2.6. I'm sorry, I'm actually having a little bit of a lag in toggling my screen. Pardon me for that. So after a screen level climate change physical risk has been undertaken and you have identified what those climate risks are, it's really important to start thinking about how would you or what can you do to actually minimize those risks and make your asset more and more climate resilient. And really in the 4th step, that is identification of potential responses, we need to kind of do an assessment of what is adaptive capacity of the asset, which means what are the features of the asset which are already making it a little resilient towards climate. And these are site-specific or asset-specific features, which could be topographic or even design features. So it's important to identify those and then get into a phase where you start thinking about what are the implications of climate change on my asset, on my operations. And this is where you do a detailed mapping of the various aspects of your businesses and how climate change is likely to impact them. And basis that really come up with a high level adaptation and resilience strategy as to what are those measures that you could actually undertake to ensure that the impacts of climate change, if not completely eliminated, will at least be minimized. And there is a variety of adaptation measures that can be implemented, which we will walk you through in the subsequent slides. So from there, we really come into the phase 2, where you have identified the climate risks in the step 1. So now you want to start thinking about, okay, there are these risks, but what does it mean to my business, specifically in terms of dollar value? Because as I said, TCFD is all about identifying what the financial risks or financial implications to a certain business or an investment is. And after doing that, we start quantifying those, and then eventually go on to the next phase of developing adaptive strategies. Right. So some of the quantification measures are being shown here. So it's a combination of really monitoring and evaluating and actually quantifying what those impacts would be. So you can have a series of monitoring systems being implemented. This could mean, kind of taking measurements of water quality, water levels, wind speed, so on and so forth. So generating all the data that's going to help you do a much more detailed quantification, and then kind of seeing how those are impacting your assets. So to the map to the right hand side, you can see that's a typical product of what we call as a flood risk assessment. So for an area which is prone to flooding, how you would want to quantify is conduct a flood risk assessment at that area and try to see which areas across the asset or the site are more prone to flooding than the others, and how will your site react to a certain flooding event. It can also help you identify what is the highest level, or what we call as HFL, or a high flood level that is likely to be experienced across the site, because that is what will help you design your flood mitigation measures or adaptation strategies as well. And then to complement that, what you can also do is do a damage and loss estimation, which actually is a process of giving all those risks a certain dollar value, which means how many $1 million will it cost my organization in terms of losses or damages if an event of a certain magnitude or intensity occurs. And these are the kind of numbers that is going to help you get a buy-in from your top management, because unless you can quantify something in terms of dollar damage, you cannot really take an informed decision as to, okay, how do I prioritize this risk, and what do I do next, and which of these 5 or 6 hazards are more important to me than others, and which I should take up earlier than the rest. So going to the quantification and adaptation, really. So what you can see here is really a few examples of what that adaptation strategy should look like. To begin with, every organization, after it has identified and quantified the climate risks, needs to have a climate adaptation, which basically is really a very systematic way of making a roadmap and identifying what steps do I need to take to actually make my asset more and more climate proof. From there, and for every hazard or every risk, there will be multiple options that you could implement. Some of these could be physical measures, such as construction of a sea wall by the sea face, so that it can take away some of the wave energy. So that's more of what we call as with physical measures. Some of these could be also soft measures or green measures, such as the mangroves that you see below, which are natural and more what we call as the nature-based solutions to actually, which probably do the same job as a seawall would do, but in a much different way. So out of all these options that you would have to make your asset climate resilient, it's very important to go through a process called as economics of climate adaptation, or ECA, which is a systematic way of identifying which of these measures have a much higher success rate than others. And these involve on alternatives such as the technical complexity, its impact on the communities, its regulatory implications, its damage or benefit to the environment, and so on and so forth. So this is the view of a climate dashboard that we've developed for our clients really. So this is a tool that we have been providing to our clients at screening level, specifically for clients or for industries who have multiple assets spread across geographies. And what we really help the clients do is identify all those climate risks, put them on a screen, and help you rate them cumulatively and rank them, and identify that out of the total 85 assets that I have, well, what are the top 10 assets that have the highest vulnerability, and what are the top 3 climate risks which my type of business has a highest impact on. And some of the key natural hazards or climate stressors that we review in this process have been shown to the left hand side. And what you see to the right is really illustration view of the climate dashboard that we have. So many of you will have this question now. Okay, you've spoken about climate risks, you have spoken about adaptation, but what are the various types of adaptation measures that are available today that can be implemented? And typically these are categorized under 5 different types of responses. First is enabling responses. So this is more of a soft measure where you want to enable people. This could be your staff, it could be your stakeholders, it could be communities, or this could be governmental agencies, to actually prepare for potential climate change events. This could also mean having certain early warning systems or enhanced data collection approaches to improve the understanding of a certain hazard. And we believe that this is the very first step, and it is also a continuous step that every organization has to embark upon before actually identifying any physical climate adaptation strategies or response measures that we have. A second type of response measure really is social responses, which focuses on building capacity and understanding amongst the various stakeholders and affected communities. And these could be facilitated through having certain educational programs, having trainings and community awareness programs, and just making those stakeholders more and more aware and adaptable towards the changing climate. The third type of response is also called as management responses, which basically means developing certain management plans. These could be coastal zone management plans, or these could also be managing your existing infrastructure to handle the climate related events more effectively. This can be as simple as managing or maintaining your stormwater drainage infrastructure, not only on site but off site as well, so that in case of a heavy rainfall event, your asset will be much more capable of managing that flood than otherwise. The fourth type is green response. So these are the responses which actually promote resilience through use of natural systems such as mangroves for coastal protection. You saw a few slides back. There was a very nice picture of mangroves, and mangroves have been established to work very effectively against decreasing that wave energy during a storm event or a sea level rise to chronic event, and also preventing certain coastal assets and also minimizing coastal erosion. And then last but not the least, and so something that is probably more seen these days, is the physical responses, which means building physical structures or systems to protect against potential hazards. So these could include beach erosion controls, construction of flood walls, or maybe elevation of the height of buildings and infrastructures. So we have another Zoom poll here. So amongst the options below, which do you think is the first step in screening your climate physical risks? And there you go. Okay, we will end the poll and see what the votes say. And as expected, I think there were two clear winners here. First is identifying your physical domain, and also identifying the climate hazard. So yes, depending upon the maturity of the organization, you may choose either of the two, but these are mostly done together, with starting with kind of defining the physical domain of your project, and then going ahead and trying to identify what those climate risks are. There is another question for us, and I will launch that right now. So what outcomes can you expect after conducting a climate change risk assessment? And you can go ahead and choose 1, 2, 3, or all 4. I would encourage you to think about how or which of these are relevant to your businesses, the business that you are managing right now. Okay. We can end the poll now. Okay, and I think this is a good spread there. We have equal number of participants voting for the first 3. And that's, I think, a very, very true theme, because I think those are the 3 most important aspects that you need to understand from a business standpoint, and start getting those outcomes and embedding them in your risk management systems. Right, from there, I will just give it over to my colleague, Yulia, who will walk us through the last section. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Aniket. Let's start with some key messages from today's session, and then we will go to questions and answers. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Yep. So here are key takeaways from today's discussion. Well, first of all, as we saw in the introductory session, there are clear business drivers why to start assessing climate-related risks and opportunities for your business or organization, and why to start thinking about disclosing these. There are a lot of drivers from the side of the investors, lenders, regulators in our region as well. Actually, we can see also a lot more customers of the companies, especially manufacturing, agribusiness companies operating in this region, looking into higher transparency of disclosures of their suppliers. So all in all, I think that's the direction that we definitely recommend you to take. Secondly, Climate hazards and physical climate impacts could be both direct and indirect for your business. So this you would need to take into account. And when you look into potential business implications, try to also look along the whole value chain, not just only at your operations. Thirdly, TCFD and associated frameworks are really focusing on financial risks and business implications more than anything else. And this is quite unique for TCFD and makes it stand out against other ESG frameworks. So really, even though GHG emissions and your emission profile would be quite important to understand potential risks related to low carbon economy transition, the whole TCFD framework is really about how resilient your business to climate related impacts rather than how your business impacts the climate. Fourthly, there are publicly available scenarios for future climate projections. As we mentioned at the beginning of this session, there is a new IPCC report that has just recently been issued. There are new scenarios there that potentially would become a benchmark for future physical climate risk assessment. And a small hint, they are already more linked to socioeconomic scenarios that are also more relevant for transition risk assessment, which we'll talk about during the next session. But for the time being, even using our RCP scenarios from the previous IPCC report is also plausible. And again, when we talk about physical climate risks, the worst case climate scenario and the highest potential climate impacts would be more relevant rather than low carbon scenario that is more relevant for transition risks and opportunities assessment. We at RAM have been supporting various clients around the region and the world in their TCFD journey. We are very pleased to say that some of our clients already looked into TCFD disclosures, even right when the Tcfd recommendations have been published. So we have long-standing experience, and even before recommending TCFD on the scenario analysis, we had been doing that for companies even outside of TCFD framework before it was established. So if you have any follow-up questions after today's session that we may not be able to take, please feel free to reach out to CMM or us directly, and we would be happy to support you or address some of your queries. Finally, I would just like to mention again that TCFD is a journey. Don't worry if you don't have yet enough resources, capacities, or understanding even where to start from. I hope our today's and tomorrow's session will at least help in understanding what would be the most critical steps and where you can start from. And of course, over time, you can go into more in-depth analysis and disclosures while building internal capacities for doing so. And just a sneak peek for tomorrow's session. So tomorrow we'll speak, we won't do a recap of TCFD anymore. We'll just go straight into business. We'll discuss in more detail transition risks and opportunities, and hope you will understand better what are the main drivers for low carbon economy transition, what are key scenarios, and how to approach transition risk assessment as a journey and a workflow. All right, thank you very much for that. I think we can open up the Q&A session, and I will welcome Aniket back to the floor as well. Aniket, any particular questions that attracted your attention you would like to start from?
Yeah, so I kind of, there were a few very interesting questions, Yulia. Thanks everybody who has sent those in. And I have already answered them live on, as in the Q&A box in the time that I got. So in case there are any more that you have, please, we could try and kind of have those answered here as well.
Okay, how about the question number one? What options do we have for climate change adaptation, and how effective are they expected to prove?
Right, great. So I think if you remember a couple of slides back, we saw that there are 5 different categories of climate responses or climate adaptation measures. And I won't say that any one of them works best. It's usually a combination of all of them, or at least a few of them. So it's really a very asset specific or a geography or a site specific adaptation strategy that needs to consider combination of these measures so that you have the highest possible impact. And while we are talking about adaptation, we also need to be mindful around maladaptation. So maladaptation is a term which has been coined quite recently, because certain adaptation measures implemented in one place have the ability to lead to certain detrimental impacts of somewhere else. And hence it's very important to actually consider a much more holistic picture of actually identifying adaptation measures to increase resilience towards climate. So it's a really site specific, or it's a case to case kind of a strategy and a suite of measures or responses that needs to be evaluated.
All right, thank you very much, Aniket. I have another question about with varying sources of data resolution available, this would undoubtedly create varying outcomes in the scenario analysis and can affect whether an asset is determined to be vulnerable or not. How do we manage this when doing TCFD assessments?
I think that's a wonderful question, and that kind of draws our attention towards data sanitization as well, because as I said, there are many of those data sources available, but not all may not be appropriate or applicable or well established for that particular area. So it's very important to identify which one of the data sources and data models suited for the assessment, and hence although there is a platform that suits us. And if you don't do that, then it's quite possible that some of the outcomes of that climate change risk assessment may be different than what it would be.
All right, thank you very much. I have one more question for you, also related to scenario analysis. So the scenarios are quite high level scenarios like greenhouse gas emissions or seawater rise, but how to connect it actually to the banks or assets or the financial impacts?
Right, so it's really a step-by-step process, isn't it? So once we have chosen a certain scenario, we will need to access the climate data, which is corresponding to that particular scenario for that particular location. And then once you've identified the hazards that the assets could be exposed to, we really need to convert those hazards into risks, which means, what is exposure or vulnerability of my asset to those climate hazards. And once you have established or converted those hazards into risks, you need to really work your way around trying to see what kind of financial impacts will that risk have on your asset. And that is what I meant about giving a dollar value to those climate risks, which means, for example, if there's a flooding hazard or a flooding risk that a certain asset could be exposed to, then we need to really start doing a detailed quantification and analysis of, okay, if there is a flood that happens in that area at my asset, what is the actual damages or losses that I may incur? Because once we have that dollar value, you may be able to really quantify, oh, okay, so if this flooding event happens and I'm set to lose $5 million, so then you will have to kind of start thinking into, oh, okay, so this is going to be a business interruption for me. And not only can you prioritize that at a corporate level or at the board level, also try to take steps ahead and trying to kind of get more quantification of those flooding events at your site, and then design your adaptation and flood mitigation measures based on that.
Mm-hmm.
Hope that answers.
All right. Thank you very much, Aniket. I will answer the next question. So do scenarios take into consideration transition pathways? Does it make sense to do an integrated scenario analysis combining both physical and transition scenarios? I think we've touched a little bit upon that, for instance, the new scenarios under the new IPCC report already integrate the transition thinking with the physical climate impacts thinking. But so far, like using the previous IPCC report and transition scenarios, we actually normally tend to apply a little bit different sets of scenarios for physical risks and transition risk assessment, but then bringing them back to the same kind of denominator, like in terms of the temperature increase towards the end of the century. I think that's a very helpful approach. And the reason being is because normally for physical risks, you really need to look into more specific changes in the climate parameters and how they impact the increased severity or frequency of climate-related hazards, as Aniket explained. Whereas for transition risks and opportunities, you first and foremost focus on socioeconomic changes in the systems. So the nature of scenarios are slightly different, and the drivers and the scenarios would be different. That's why we normally would recommend, and again, in line with TCFD, different types of scenarios. But going forward, this thinking may be changing as per your comment that perhaps more comprehensive scenarios would be more and more appearing on the market. And a quick note that more advanced companies also start developing their own bespoke scenarios. And we see this upcoming trend on the market. And those scenarios take into consideration all different parameters that are more relevant to specifics of this or that business. Aniket, I've noticed a very interesting question for you related to physical risks again. Is there a localized scenario for the country that can be adapted to the local context, especially physical risks, which is more geographically related?
So yes, so basically what the trend that we are seeing increasingly, there is just one scenario that most organizations adapt, that's 8.5. Especially this is valid for our Asia Pacific and Southeast Asian region because of the extreme impacts and extreme changes in the climate that are expected to happen in this area. So it's really the RCP 8.5 or the BAUs that are the main go-to scenarios per se. With respect to local context, I think during the process of doing a climate change risk assessment, it is also important to look for what the national and regional climate action plans are, or what kind of climate adaptation strategies have been drafted or implemented by the governing agencies. And because there's a good opportunity for us to not only align our climate risks and opportunities along those, also find out an option of actually piggybacking on some of these. For example, if there is a certain adaptation project which is already ongoing at a regional level, which may have a positive impact on your asset, might as well align our adaptation strategy with that project or those projects so that we can reach a eventual endpoint in a much sooner and a more efficient and a cost-based way.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. I can see some questions in relation to best TCFD reports as examples. Well, we cannot really promote any specific company here, but definitely try to look into organizations that have been already for a few years in their journey. Normally, these reports would be much more in depth and more detailed. There are also publications by TCFD and their partners in relation to best practice over like the last year of TCFD disclosures, where some good practices are summarized, and not just overall disclosures, but actually pillar by pillar. So you can see best examples in terms of governance, best examples of how risks are assessed and presented in the TCFD disclosures. So this is very helpful. And what we always recommend also is to do, as one of the initial steps, is peer assessment, and to see what your peers or leaders in your sector actually present as their TCFD disclosures, to use as some sort of the, not benchmark, but rather guidance in terms of what are material risks relevant to your business and how risks and opportunities could be actually presented in line with TCFD. And this analysis could also help you identify some typical gaps across your peers. So what are the most challenging areas in disclosures in your business? Aniket, I can see more and more questions pouring around physical risks assessment, which is quite natural given the topic of our today's session. If you don't mind, maybe just a few more. So during performing
Absolutely.
a physical scenario analysis, would you suggest a top-down approach or a company-by-company analysis? This is a very interesting question, and I'm sure there is no direct answer to that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You kind of gave an answer to that. You already there's no a right or wrong answer really. It's mostly the directive and the ambitions of organizations. We have seen that certain organizations having a certain asset or a type of asset which is already exposed to a certain climate risk, taking those up on priority and having a climate risk assessment and adaptation strategy done for that. On the other hand, we have seen large companies with large portfolios taking a top-down approach where they kind of have done a portfolio screening at a very early stage at the board level to kind of identify what are those top 10 or top 15 or top 5 assets at the highest risk in their portfolio. And then that helps them in prioritizing actions and probably start thinking about what are alternatives that we have around this. And then from there, there could be a deep dive risk assessment that could be done on a few of those assets which have high exposure. So as I said, no right or wrong here. It really depends upon what the organizational ambitions are and what their goals are and how complex is their actual portfolio.
All right, thank you very much, Aniket. There are quite a couple of questions around adaptation and loss and damage assessments. Maybe let's pick some of those. For example, is there any tool or guidance that we can use to estimate loss and damage of an asset as a result of physical events like flood?
Good question. There are no ready-made tools, but because now damage and loss estimations are something that are very specific to a certain type of assets. There could be certain publications which could be sector specifics, such as damage and losses from climate change for maybe a mining sector or maybe a transportation sector. But these are typically at a sectoral level and they may not always be relevant to your business or to your asset. So prima facie, it's always prudent to kind of undertake that kind of assessment at an asset to asset level rather than on any available any publicly available tool or literature around that. And we have been doing this a lot, and there are various stages of doing that. So you can do a very rough, like a back of an envelope and kind of an estimation as well. Wherein right now we are supporting some clients where we are working at their asset level, at their process level, and seeing what are the individual processes that might get impacted because of a certain climate risk. And if they do, what is the expected loss and damage that could be expected from that.
All right, thank you very much, Aniket. Then there was a question about adaptation. Give me 1 second. Yeah. So how can financial institutions support climate adaptation in a commercially viable way? Is there a promising return on investment, especially for preventive action for public or common good? That's a very tricky one.
No, it is tricky one. And I think if somebody would have asked me that question 5 years back, I would have said no. But things have changed. And things are evolving right now where large financial institutions or DFIs are now becoming more and more outward in their climate approach, where there is a constant encouragement for organizations to not only make their assets climate proof, but also the surroundings, which means you are not only doing good for your own assets, but you are also safeguarding communities around that. There are trusts, there are various organizations, there are various non-governmentals or even governmental organizations and departments which are very keen on collaborating. And that's why, as I said, if there is one of the key steps when you're doing a climate adaptation strategy is to identify what are those national or regional level climate action plans and adaptation plans already implemented in that area, and how best can we align our strategies with those so that we can not only get a certain output at the best possible cost, but also have a maximum impact and a minimum time of implementation.
I fully agree, Aniket.
And by doing that, we are also building relationships with communities, with our neighboring industries, with stakeholders, and with governmental agencies as well.
And actually, because of so many co-benefits of climate adaptation projects, there are a lot of development organizations out there, and the international finance organizations like Green Climate Fund or World Bank Group that are actually very keen on supporting climate adaptation programs or projects and provide additional funding to make them more economically attractive. And especially if you are coming from financial institution and interested in supporting these initiatives on your end, the chance of getting additional public support would be much higher with the private sector involvement from the start.
Absolutely.
I would like to pick up another question. I saw it somewhere. Okay, shall a company define its climate statement first before having TCFD disclosure, or can it be concurrently done? There is no right or wrong here. We have seen a lot of companies providing their TCFD disclosures, not even being official supporters on the TCFD website, which is, by the way, not so hard to do and quite recommended, especially because this official TCFD support is now becoming an integral part of some of the ESG ratings and rankings. So your company organization will be actually assessed based off your company's appearance on the TCFD website as an official supporter. So be aware of that. And if you support publicly TCFD, then the rule of thumb would be that within like next year or so, you would prepare your first TCFD report. Aniket, any other question that attracts your attention you'd like to pick up?
No, I see a question here. Can you share examples of successful climate adaptation projects in Southeast Asia? Well, there are quite a few. I would say not directly where ERM has been involved, but I can see certain countries being more active on this, specifically countries such as Thailand, Indonesia, which are very prone to coastal flooding, and big cities in these countries are now at the risk of getting displaced. And so there are countries which have implemented adaptation measures. Some of the less endowed countries are seeking funding from World Bank, such as I know that Bangladesh, there are certain parts of Bangladesh which are very prone to coastal flooding, specifically the delta regions in the south, where there is a very eager call from the various donor organizations across the world to actually help make these areas, and these are large areas, specifically 1/3 of the area of the entire country of Bangladesh is at a risk of getting lost to the sea. So many such examples. I think all of these are up there on the internet. I don't want to be talking about a few here, because all of them are equally important for the countries and for the assets which are being protected by these. So you can reach out to us at a later time in case you need any specific information around a certain country or a certain geography. We're happy to give that information to you.
I would like to add to what Aniket has just said. We see more and more trend towards cross-cutting types of projects that would, on the one hand, create adaptation benefits and at the same time lead to potential carbon removals. And a good example could be any kind of nature-based solutions, for example, to protect shoreline from the sea level rise, as Aniket mentioned already. So, for example, mangrove restoration, that's a classical project that could kill two birds in one stone, as we say. I see a question in the chat box as well. Is there a separate report needed to upload on TCFD website? No, you don't need to upload anything on TCFD website except for your willingness to support TCFD and become an official supporter. So usually TCFD disclosures are becoming an integral part of your usual annual reporting process. A best practice is to include TCFD disclosures in your annual report, because again, it's not about your sustainability, it's more about your financial stability. So that's why ideally TCFD and financial sector stakeholders would like to see TCFD disclosures as part of your financial disclosures on the annual report. Sustainability report is another avenue, and we see a lot of examples like that. There could be an annex or a chapter related to climate strategy as part of your sustainability report document. Another way, for example, is to put separate TCFD disclosure on your website, publicly available, and provide just a short summary in an annual or sustainability report. Just some of the examples. Okay. Apart from IPCC and RCPs, are there any other scenarios that you would suggest for financial institutions for physical risk assessment, Aniket, I believe?
Yeah, so good question, and I think a very timely question indeed. So with the CMIP6 or the IPCC AR6 report being released, there are different sets of climate scenarios that have now been released. So contrary or in support of the RCPs or representative concentration pathways, you now have something called as SSPs or shared socio-economic pathways. These are more in numbers, and these now not only look at absolute impacts of climate change on temperatures, but also look at how these might impact societies, people, and countries. So it's a much more granular a lens of looking at climate impacts, not just from one angle, but from multiple angles. And it's just a matter of time that now that the IPCC AR6 has been released, very soon the CMIP5 data sets that we have been using will be phased out and be replaced by the CMIP6, which will have many more of these pathways or scenarios than earlier.
Okay, thank you, Aniket. I see another very good question. Do we need to update the physical climate risk analysis? When should we update it once we have created it?
Very good question. So yes, the answer to this is yes, because although the climate hazards might not change, the climate risks might change. Meaning how is a certain climate stressor impacting that area? And the fact is that we are in such a rapidly changing world where there are so many externalities that are actually contributing to not just climate change, but the overall way in which our surroundings are responding to climate change. And it is recommended that we relook at our climate change risk assessment every 4 to 5 years, and make sure that whatever adaptation strategy we have already embarked upon on that journey is really aligned with some of the more recent trends, because we would have seen that every year we can see the impacts of climate change around us increasing in their magnitude, in their intensity, in their likelihood. So we really cannot be sure about whatever scenarios we have developed for right now, and the results of that today will be valid 5 years from now. So it's a very new science. So most companies have started looking at climate risks maybe just five years back, and we know that some of our clients are already coming back to us and asking us to redo a scenario analysis for them. And also with the new data sets coming in, the CMIP6 or AR6 data sets, there are more extreme projections that have been worked out already. So your climate adaptation strategy might look a little different now with the CMIP6 data sets now coming in than how it would look right now.
Thank you, Aniket. And I guess those timelines of 4 or 5 years that you mentioned also coincide with the IPCC reports. That's roughly
Yes.
the timelines for these big scientific updates. And now we're in a new era of the 6th report now.
It is indeed so.
All right, I can see some more questions. Does ERM help national and local government authorities in developing local adaptation plan and strategies? We do, yes. Even though, of course, we work a lot more with the private sector companies and businesses in their sustainability and climate journey, we also work with national and local governments. And actually, a good example of such project would be a very recent climate low carbon city project in Thailand, where we were working with 4 selected city governments as well as the national level government. with the support of the United Nations in developing climate mitigation adaptation plans. And the most recent phase of the project also took into account how these could be adapted in the new normal under COVID-19. So how COVID-19 actually impacts climate change plans of the cities. A very interesting projects, and if you are interested, happy to share more details later on. We also work with the government of Malaysia on a few initiatives at the national level. That's definitely how we also know all the recent policy and regulatory updates that we're happy to bring back to our business clients. Aniket, maybe that's for you. How to get the data, both historical and projected? I think we touched upon a little bit on this in the slide deck, but maybe to reiterate.
Right. So as I said, there's a lot of research that has happened around climate change. There's been decades and decades of work being done by research organizations, intergovernmental panels, and academia. And all of that information is out there in form of global climate models or general circulation models and regional climate models as well. And all of that data is sitting up there. The only challenge is that data is actually huge and it's very complex. So usually a rather less scientific or a non-scientific person would not really be able to do much with that data. And that is where you need some help in actually not only extracting that data, but also processing it, analyzing that data, converting that data into a certain risk, and then finding out what the implications of that risk are on your assets or on your businesses. So yeah, this may look like a very simple kind of a two-step process, but actually if you go into the intricacies of it and the vastness of the data and the complexities associated with it, it does require a certain amount of training to actually know what to do with that data and trying to make sense of that data for our assets and for our businesses.
All right, thank you very much. I'm checking for other questions. Is there any country-wise TCFD acceptance or support data? Well, yes and no. First of all, TCFD is an international recommendative framework, let's put it this way. So again, there are a lot of recommendations. There are sectoral guidance under TCFD, how to approach climate-related financial risks and opportunities assessment. At the same time, many countries are already adopting their own national guidelines, how to interpret TCFD in the local context. And as we know, for example, in Malaysia, Bursa is also working on such guidelines for Malaysian companies. Singapore is another example where recently, like earlier this year, the paper has been published by Monetary Authority of Singapore, and many other examples in our region. So definitely it's coming, and I think that the best way to understand what would be coming is to really interact with the key regulators or public sector actors in the respective country to see what would be the upcoming guidelines or perspectives. But again, even though these guidelines are localized, still the main guiding document would be Tcfd Recommendations. So what we suggest is to look into the main document from 2017, any most recent updates, especially in relation to scenario analysis and sectoral guidance that is relevant to your respective business organization. Okay. I think we are actually done with most of the questions. If we haven't touched upon some of these, we are happy to also respond separately, or as we mentioned before, please feel free to reach out to Aniket and myself. You can see our contacts on the slide in front of you. So happy to provide you more details on certain things. And yes, we will share a slide deck with you as well. And with that, Navina, back to you.
Thank you very much, Yulia and Aniket. This was really an excellent presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, as Yulia mentioned, we will be providing the slides. The slides will be available on our website, and CMM will be sending out an email to everyone with the link to the slides as well as to the full session, which will be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't registered for tomorrow's session on transition risk, you can still do so. And as you leave today's session, as you click on the leave button, you'll see that we have a feedback form, and we really appreciate your feedback. So please do fill out the form for our future events. With that, thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.